standing at a fork in the road between the possibility of a country where Christianity is completely forsaken and the possibility of a country that revives and takes pride in its Christian heritage. Those two visions of a future for Britain, what that might entail and what really is at stake.
You walk into a church, it is a refuge. The vision of having an England is really a vision that comes from Christian scholars drawing on biblical and particularly Old Testament ideas.
I'm Emma Trimble and this is GBN Originals. Now, we've seen Christianity a lot in the news recently. It's been upsetting a lot of people that Christianity seems to be sort of set by the wayside. I'm delighted to say that today we are joined by Bijan Omrani, who is the author of an interestingly titled new book entitled God is an Englishman, about Christianity and the creation of England. So thank you, Bijan, for joining us today. So I love the title, but I wondered if we could start maybe by you explaining it for us.
Yes, well, I'm not denying that God is not of any other nationality. And indeed, some of my relatives from up north were very distressed it wasn't God as a Yorkshireman. But the point of the title is to drive home something that we've forgotten, that Christianity has had an absolutely pivotal role in creating both our national institutions, our national culture, our national ethics, literature, art, music, the law, our calendar, our sense of time, our sense of landscape, our mad vicars, so many things which we take for granted in national life. And I think since the middle of the 20th century, we've become disconnected from an understanding of how much Christianity has contributed to what we're so used to and what we really take for granted. So that's the main point of the title.
So there's a wonderful quote in one of the early chapters of the book that I'll just read out quickly. You said, "The presence of Christianity reaches back to before the emergence of England as a country and has been a lodestar in the development of nearly every facet of English life." And you mentioned a list of things there. You mentioned in the book law, language, literature, as you said, the calendar, our spirituality. I wonder if maybe you could take us through some examples of the way that Christianity, has been the kind of cradle in which England and the English was raised from an infant. If you could take us through a few examples of how Christianity has been so inextricably bound with England for the last 1,700 years.
Absolutely. Well, I think one of the best places to start is with the very existence of England as a nation state. I mean, we take it for granted that nations just exist. But if you go back to the Dark Ages, if you go back to that period after the end of the Roman Empire, it's by no means a given that nation states would come to exist as a natural form of human or political life. And the vision of having an England is really a vision that comes from Christian scholars drawing on biblical and particularly Old Testament ideas. So we think of the Venerable Bede, who was living from about 670 to 730, and I think he's one of the great heroes of the book. Not just him, but scholars of him and previous generations, Christian scholars, had this vision of a single people on the model of the Old Testament nation of Israel, a single people under a single law, under a single king who was under God, and the king was responsible to God for the morality and the conduct of his people. So that idea of a single nation, although it wasn't a reality in Bede's time, it was a vision that he had for England, and it was later kings, particularly Alfred and Athelstan, dealing with the challenge of Viking invasions, who draw from this vision of Bede, and a single nation under one set of language, one set of literature, one religion, would be something that could coalesce. So the vision of national unity is something that really comes from a Christian biblical origin. And even the name England, again, that's another thing we can completely take for granted. Why England? Why not Saxonia? Why not, because we had Jutes as well, why not Jutania or something like that? Might sound prettier than England, I don't know. But it comes down to another sort of great interest with Bede. And there's a very famous scene where there are slaves who are brought from these islands to Rome. And in Rome, you have Gregory, who later became Pope. And he saw these fair-haired slaves in the marketplace. And he said, where are they from? And he was told, they are Angles, St. Angli, they're Angles. And he said, no, they're not Angles, they're angels. No, Angli said Angeli in the Latin. And he loved a gag, Pope Gregory. He loved his puns. But this pun was legendary as it might have been, was something very serious to Bede. And it indicated a sense that there was almost a sense of predestination, a sense of mission that would be expressed through the name of the island. So, I mean, before this scene, Bede tends to refer to the Saxons. Afterwards, he talks more about Anglia, the Angles. So that pun, that little joke of Pope Gregory, comes really to trend the name from Saxonia. And as you see it with the later kings, Alfred, Athelstan, they start to move to Anglo-Saxonia, England. So even our name is owed to that origin.
Before taking it back onto the history side of things, because I think that there's so much there that we can talk about, I wanted to take us off on a slight early tangent, because I think the Victorians had a real appreciation for the kind of enchantment of the Anglo-Saxon, the medieval period. And you've mentioned the way in which Christianity shaped foundational English ideas. And I wonder, many of the crises that we face today is effectively a crisis of authority. And you mentioned King Alfred. Obviously, there's another wonderful story of how King Alfred, as a child, was anointed by the Pope. And it's from Alfred that this idea of an England emerges, and it's so inextricably bound up with Alfred's incredibly strong faith. And of course, Alfred is somebody that we don't really learn very much about in English schools, which I think is a real shame. I wonder if you have any thoughts on how the decline of Christianity has had an implication for our understanding as a country of authority, and maybe has contributed to a lot of the crises that we face today.
Yes, I mean, that's a very interesting and rich question. I think that one thing that's very important to think about in terms of sources of authority is how much adherence to authority comes from within ourselves because we believe in our hearts in the validity of the morality and the ethics which we are presented with, and how much of it comes from a sense of external force. We have rules, we've got procedures, we have to follow them. And I think that, and this is something that arises a lot, certainly during the evangelical revival of the later 18th and early 19th century, where you move from this period of, great corruption in English life towards a sense of very strict morality that comes with Christianity being taken much more seriously, is that we owe to that period a sense of being bound by the ethics of Christianity from our hearts. So, a very interesting example is if you look at some of the writings and diaries of those evangelical philanthropists, evangelical preachers, no one's reading their diaries, but there are an extraordinarily fierce critique of their own lives. I've been lazy today. I got out of bed late and I didn't spend enough time reading the Bible. I haven't spent enough time helping other people. And that's a critique of the self. And it comes because you deeply believe in the Christian ethics and you yourself are, from your heart, following the rules. You're doing good from your heart. And I think an interesting facet of the evaporation of Christianity from a general sense of belief in public life is that we're still trying to use those good ethics that come into public life in the 19th century, the idea of honor, behaving well in public life. But people aren't believing it in their hearts. So we're trying harder and harder to flog procedures, rules, watchdogs, but without a sense of ethics that come and bind you from within, you're just going to try to weave your way around external rules and pay no attention to it. So I think actually that's a very interesting change in our relationship to authority. We regulate ourselves with a deep sense of Christian ethics, but if that's not there, then we're just going to try and wriggle our way out of it because we don't believe in any absolute moral sense of good or bad from our hearts.
You mentioned already the influence of the biblical idea of Israel on the emergence of nations, the idea of one people. I wonder, whether, as you were saying there, that people not believing in the Christian ethics in their own hearts and the implications that has, say, on politics and public service. How much does that have to do with the idea of multiculturalism? And I don't just mean the fact that there are now a lot of people living in England or in Britain that have come from elsewhere, but on this idea that Christianity and the culture of this country is not something that is privileged anymore within the state, that is something that is taken to be that which should bind us together as one people.
Yes, I mean, it would be wrong of me to say that other religions don't have strong ideas of ethics, and of course, many do. Some of them might be in contrast with Christianity, but again, with the rise of multiculturalism in the 50s, 60s, 70s, that was one ingredient in a collapse in self-confidence about the religion. It wasn't the only ingredient, in my view, but it has been a particular ingredient where we're frightened to own that religious inheritance, and we're frightened to say that there was anything good about it because we're now in this world of very great variety. But I think that in that discussion and thinking about why we've lost that sense of self-confidence in the faith, we have to look back again at what happened in the 60s. And I think there are several ingredients. Up until that time, English culture was a very great culture of religion-generating association. And again, this is another thing which we owe to the evangelical revival of the 18th and 19th centuries. People came together in all sorts of chapels, churches, religious clubs, Bible reading groups, choirs, around churches, and even things like football teams, sewing circles, charitable groups, penny banks, where you had the opportunity, living with other people, to live out the capacity to be charitable and to help other people and to serve other people. I mean, that very fundamental fruit of Christian faith and Christian ethics. And those groups, which were absolutely legion, were something that was a part of church life, and they were a deep part of our social life. You had to be a part of these. There was no life outside of these groups of association. But with the 60s, you had this sudden perfect storm of new ideas and new technology. So firstly, the rise of the LP, the television, the radio, transport, affluence, other ways of associating with other people, which meant that you didn't really need to get together with each other, especially in those groups which were centered around churches. So at that generation, the young, instead of wanting to go to church to be with other people and then take in the culture of the church, take in the biblical, scriptural culture, the musical culture, the ethical culture, suddenly it all shatters and they don't need to get together anymore in the way that they did. And I think since that time, the churches have been reeling from what I call in the book this crisis of association, because people don't come together under the aegis of the church to live out that life in social ways, they just don't, those streams for passing on Christian ideals have really come apart. So as much as multiculturalism, those changes, and also another big change is a change in our ideas of psychology. And again, I think this is when we talk about multiculturalism, this is an American import from the West Coast of privileging the desires of the self and letting it all hang out, do what is good for you above the wider needs of the people around you and the society around you. So I point to that famous slogan for the Access credit card from the 70s, take the waiting out of wanting. I want it now, I want to be satisfied now, and just as long as I'm pleased, I don't really care about anyone around me. And all of that's the profound change, and that's taken up by advertisers, marketers, as selling a lifestyle. So it's not about you building up slow communities under an ethical aegis, an ethical framework, but it's about me now, and I don't care about anything around me. And that was a big change, and it's been very hard for the church and all clubs and associations, I think, to deal with that since then.
You've described those things that we have lost or discarded as a result of the decline of Christianity. But what about those things that we've retained? Because obviously you've literally written the book on this. You must see it everywhere around you. But many people who, maybe have only just started, you're paying attention to the many interesting books that are coming out in this area at the moment. Maybe people don't necessarily notice these things because they are so much the norm of, being English and living in England. I wonder, if, maybe you could draw people's attention to some of those things that are very Christian, that even the non-religious, may experience or may believe, but perhaps don't notice. I'm thinking maybe, for example, the landscape, which is one example that you give in the book.
Well, yes, we could certainly talk about the landscape. And I mean, not just the landscape, but a lot of the art that is a part of the Christian heritage. So, for example, you can go into, say, a newish church, say a Victorian church, and you can see wall paintings, frescoes, mosaics, sculptures, architecture, which has been inspired often after the Reformation. I mean, you can see pre-Reformation stuff, but it's been inspired by a very long tradition of Christian art, which is trying to get people to find a way of visualizing that which is of another plane, of the spiritual world. So a lot of Christian art, that beautiful Gothic art full of gold and very stylized with lots of symbols. It's not about trying to represent heaven or the apostles or Christ himself exactly as they were, but it's trying to open a portal to the spiritual world. And that was a medieval idea of art, but it was also an idea that was really very much revived in the Victorian period when they began to see the validity of that medieval world. But I mean, you can take us even further from there. And a very practical thing. There are thousands and thousands of churches all over the country that open every day. And you walk into a church and they're not trying to sell you anything. They're not trying to force you to be anything. You go in and it is a refuge. And it's a place where a different set of values is offered to you. So, of course, we're living in a world of great commercialism, great hurry, trying to get you to be things, trying to get you to buy things. But the church, you go into a church, and because we have this set of churches, an established faith, is like an opposition in residence, an opposition in the landscape. Speaking of sort of deep time, speaking of the spiritual world, which is a refuge for us from all of these huge commercial pressures of change. So that's the thing around us that the church offers. I mean, the very presence of clergy to say, you are of value. I mean, the fact that we have clergy amongst us who maintain this idea that each human is made in the image of God, and that because Christ took on flesh and became man, and that says to us that there is dignity in us, there is worth in us, and that you have both people in clergy and churches which offer us this idea is a hugely important thing that even people who don't necessarily believe, it's an important thing for them to hear, and it's an important refuge in this very complex and busy life that we have. What
you're describing, it suggests touches on this vast treasure trove of great, rich theological, historical, philosophical resources that have shaped the country as we know it today, whether we realize it or not. And I wonder, you write in the book about this sense of that has been maybe over the last 70 years or so, this sense of the inevitability of Christian decline, that Christianity is something that is not relevant for whichever decade we're in, and is something that should be placed in the past and something that we move on from as we move forward in time. And I wonder, you've spoken about the ways in which, there have been many negative things very commonly, particularly after the sort of atheist movement of people like Richard Dawkins, the association of Christianity with inquisitions and witch trials and colonialism and slavery and all of these things. I wonder, whether you could say more about the positive contributions, not only that Christianity has made, but from this great treasure trove of resources, what Christianity actually has to offer to England and the English as we move forward in time.
Well, it's a very big question. I mean, one could talk about ideas of identity and the fact that Christianity has contributed so much to the things we take for granted, like the development of the law, the development of our poetry, the development of our calendars and so on, that we need an understanding of Christianity to anchor us and help us to understand our identity for the future. That's one thing. But again, and I talk about this at great length in the book, but also I think the important thing to remember is that Christianity still has, and never lost, a deep spiritual sense of offering. The point about science, I mean, we talk about the new atheists, Richard Dawkins, they very much overplayed their hand, because the idea of science is not going to answer the most fundamental questions about life. Why does anything exist? Why are we here at all? Those aren't questions that are amenable to answers through scientific method. Scientific method is very good at observing things in small pieces, in miniature, and answering questions about circumscribed matters of physics, but not metaphysics. And that whole body of Christian thought, Christian literature, Christian culture, which has developed, and in England in particular, over hundreds of years, is a guide for those questions which we still ask in our hearts. Why are we here? If there is a God, if there is a God that is beyond this realm, that is infinite, how do we grapple with it? Well, you first turn to Scripture, but then we have the great spiritual writers of the English tradition, Dame Julian of Norwich, the Cloud of Unknowing, Walter Hilton, Richard Roller, an amazing flowering of this spiritual writing, which is very down to earth. I mean, Julian of Norwich, she was just an ordinary person, a woman, writing about this vision of God face to face, and the idea of seeing the whole world in a like a walnut shell, and grappling with the providence of God. And it's easy to read, but that anchors us in a sense of how to grapple with these profound questions. And then later on, the wonderful flowering of metaphysical poets in the 17th century, John Donne, George Herbert, Thomas Traherne, Henry Vaughan, where, again, it's very homely and it's very English in an understated way, but there's a profound sense of love, grappling with difficulty, and not being afraid to come face to face with doubts and asking hard questions of God. Whither, oh, whither art thou fled, my Lord, my love? My searches are my daily bread, but never prove. My knees pierce the earth, mine eyes the sky, and yet the sphere and the centre both to me deny that thou art there. This is George Herbert, who's a vicar, grappling with the difficulty of trying to see God. But then, he comes to grasp in the midst of these doubts. Methoughts I heard one saying, child, and I replied, my Lord. Going through the doubts to a new sense of understanding. And that's very modern, in a sense. That's written in the 17th century, in about 1630. All this stuff about doubt, wrestling with God. it's a very modern thing. What do I believe? How do I believe? Can I really believe? We've got science coming on us, but you've got these deep reserves of amazing culture, amazing poetry, which, taken in the context of our understanding of Christianity and Scripture, lead us to a better understanding.
Despite the fact that we've seen an increase in a recent Bible Society survey, there's been an increase in younger people, 18 to 24, identifying as Christian because of a rise in Catholicism and Pentecostalism. Still, there is this general trend of decline within the established church of England, the national church. And I wonder whether, speaking anecdotally from my own experience when I was growing up, there was a sense that Anglican churches gave you this tiny little slither of the tradition, and there was no sense of this great, vast 2,000 years of theology and this great richness of tradition. And when you compare it to, people's curiosity about various other religions, where they're much more sort of emboldened and being clear that there is this great richness and that there are these certain demands that are placed on you. And I wonder whether you think that the Church of England in particular has failed the nation in failing to communicate this great richness of tradition to people. And whether you think that, given that it is the established church, that is quite a significant problem for the culture of the country going forward.
Well, I think, with the caveat, one has to remember that the church is made up of many different people, many different institutions, many individual clergy, many of whom are really wonderful, do have a sense of that tradition and what that tradition, that culture can do as a piece of evangelism. But I think it is true that, again, from the 60s, with this sudden change in technology, sudden change in ideas of psychology and culture and changes in English society, they did lose that self-confidence in that inheritance. And I think that it would be a very good thing for the church really to recenter itself, to take the confidence of these amazing riches. It's like, cash in the attic or something. We have amazing stuff here. It's beautiful, it's extraordinary, it's powerful. They were astonished at his doctrine, for his words were with power. This is powerful stuff. You have to get it back into public life, teach it, show people that there is worth in what is in that past. I'm very lucky because, when I was at primary school, we started off with all of the slightly sort of hippie-ish hymns, Kumbaya, and When I Needed a Neighbour. But I ended up in a rather traditional school, and I'm very thankful to my then headmaster, great, he was from South Africa, John T. Driver. And he said, you have to have the Book of Common Prayer in the school chapel. So a combination of that and some wonderful teaching about all of this poetry, all of these traditions, all of this richness, and singing, choirs, music. I'm very lucky that I was brought up with a sense of that. Now, some other people do, but it's not something the church, I think, has done enough to support, certainly outside in the country as a whole, certainly out in the wider parishes. You go to cathedrals, you're blessed with evensongs, beautiful music, lectures, but I would ask what more can be done to support clergy in spreading that culture and people beyond that as well.
What do you think the responsibility is of, never mind the leadership of the Church of England or even clergy, people in public life? What is the responsibility, from your perspective, of your average Joe, the sort of person who might be watching this video?
Well, I would urge two things, or maybe three things. Firstly, try to be more aware of the way that Christianity has influenced life. And it may be anything from picking up the Bible, being more aware of the things that are Christian in life. Go and look at the local church. And then have a think about the ways in which it has contributed to life. Don't dismiss it out of hand because Richard Dawkins said so, or because The Guardian said so. There may be something in it. And then maybe pick up a copy of the poetry, pick up scripture, listen to the music, try to understand where it's coming from and what it's doing. And then maybe, why don't you pop to church? Why don't you see if it offers anything? And I'm going to say a fourth thing. Maybe you might not be in a place to believe the doctrines of faith, but go and volunteer. Go and volunteer in the church. Go and make the tea. Go and help them make sure that the oil tank is topped up at the right time. Go and help sweep the floor, clean up. Help the people in the church, help the congregations, help them with their charitable work. And it may be that by living out a practical life of that service and seeing how Christianity has helped to develop that ethic of service, which is still shown by the churches in their life, day to day in the parishes, and the practical, wonderful charitable work that many churches and parishes do, take a part of that. Maybe that's a path to an engagement with faith in the longer run.
See, I feel very inspired listening to you speak about this and reading your book, that, there's a sense that there's something to aspire towards, that we don't have to be as diminished as we are, that we could revive this great tradition. And I wonder, as we're sort of standing at a fork in the road between the possibility of a country where Christianity is completely forsaken and the possibility of a country that revives and takes pride in its Christian heritage, I wonder if you could say a little about those two visions of a future for Britain, what that might entail and what really is at stake.
Yes, well, as the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins says, there is the dearest freshness lives deep down things. And it's not by any means beyond the bounds of possibility. There could be a revival, and indeed, looking at these recent figures, there could well be. But I think if there is a revival, I think one of the things I would hope for is, again, a greater sense of social cohesion, because we move back to a world of shared ethics, a sense where we trust each other more, a sense where we are ready to serve each other more. I mean, what can you do for everyone else, not what can they do for you? So all of these things, which I think were components of an earlier society, which we feel in many places are ebbing away, that's a sort of sense of civilizational loss. But I think that would come as a practical benefit. I mean, I'm not saying that one should adhere to Christianity because of the practical benefits. One should do it because you are in a relationship with God, but you're trying to get to the truth of God. But I see those as being the practical benefits, and also the idea of having more of a shared culture. If you had more of the sense of all of those shared signposts of culture, which we had, because the Bible was the lodestar of literary culture, Christian music from the churches was at the heart of musical culture. It makes it easier to communicate and talk with each other because you've got a shared set of cultural signposts and reference points. So in a sense, it's easier to have a shared conversation around the heart of a shared religious culture, ultimately. I think if one moves away from that, I think you're seeing certain signs of it at the moment. I think the assisted dying, i.e. suicide bill, is a part of that which disturbs me particularly. The idea that, again, they talk about dignity, which is a word pinched from Christian discussion. But dignity doesn't mean in this discussion of assisted dying, humans having intrinsic worth. It seems to mean something more like comfort or convenience. So you have people becoming an inconvenience because they're old, because they're infirm, because they're poor or unhappy. Let's sweep them away. They're not efficient. Why bother with them? And you'll see that trend, I think, developing more and more. And also this sense of a loss of ethics that come from within, as I said earlier. What's in it for me? Politics will be, what can I get out of this? Am I serving? Doesn't matter, just as long as I'm all right. And if that becomes the primary set of ethics, then it's going to be harder and harder to trust people to cohere as a society.
Very quickly, in a word, do you think that England can survive the death of Christianity? England as we know it, as England?
I think that if we lose even the trappings, these things that we aspire to, like social cohesion, like a sense of service, which fundamentally come from Christianity, I think that's where it comes from. I think it's going to be harder and harder to cohere as a nation. I don't rule it out. There may be ways of doing it. But I think it becomes harder and harder for a people to hang together without it.
Thank you very much, Bijan Omrani. Everybody should go and buy his book. We repeat the title so you can go and have a little look for that in your nearest bookshop or online. It's God is an Englishman, Christianity and the Creation of England. Thank you again so much for joining us here on GBN Originals. Don't forget to like and subscribe this video so you can stay up to date with all of our content.